Hi everyone, I hope you guys are having a great day. So this week we're going to carry on with the lecture that we started a little bit last time, talking about types of research. So last time we talked about observational research. Today we'll talk about correlational and experimental research, as well as how to make sure we're doing high quality and ethical research. We're also going to start talking about communication today as well. And we're going to focus mainly on nonverbal communication. So all those things that we do beyond our verbal information that we share that lets people know what it is that we're really saying. And there are so many opportunities for us to use nonverbal information to help us understand a situation. And there are also a lot of possibilities of times where our nonverbal communication could actually confuse other people and make the situation a little bit harder to read. So today we're going to talk about research methods as well as communication. Now this week you will also have your first activity. So I'll be discussing the activity during the lecture video, so make sure to watch for that. And then also the activity will be due by Friday at 5 p.m. Make sure that it is at least 200 words. Make sure that you turn it in on Canvas. And if you have any questions or issues about that, let me know. I will be doing my office hours on Monday from 8 to 12, but I'm also available by email, so just let me know if you need anything. Otherwise, we're going to go ahead and get started. Alright, so last time we introduced the idea of different kinds of research, and we spent the majority of last lecture video talking about observational research. We said that observational research had the goal of describing behavior, where we're just going to watch people, make observations, and this can give us ideas that lead to other kinds of research later on. Now today we're going to talk about the other two types of research, correlational research and experimental research. Now correlational research has the goal of predicting behavior. So it says two or more variables are systematically measured and the relation or the relationship between them is assessed. The idea here is that we know that two things go together. Now with correlational research, as you'll see and I'll talk about later, we can't determine causation, so we can't say why the two things go together. We can just say that they do go together. So let me give you guys an example of this. There is a correlation between class attendance and grades, right? So as class attendance goes up, grades go up. Class attendance goes down, grades go down. Those two things are co-related. They're correlated. They go together. Now, this is correlational research, so I can't say for sure that class attendance leads to an increase in grades, that it's the reason why, that it causes it, and I can't say that the grades are the reason why people go to class. I can only say that there is a relationship between them. I would have to do experimental research if I wanted to determine causation. But sticking with correlations for now, what I can do with that information is that I can make predictions. So if I know your class attendance, I can predict your grade. And if I know your grade, I can predict your class attendance. Now, I won't be right all the time when I do that kind of prediction, unless it's a perfect correlation. And we're going to talk about the strength of correlation in a minute. But I can use this information to help me make a prediction. So when we talk about correlations, there are a couple of things to keep in mind. And the first is the direction. So we're going to have positive correlations and negative correlations. So a positive correlation means that the two things that are associated go in the same direction. So they both increase together or decrease together. So the slide says increases in one variable, increases in the other variable, but they also decrease together as well. Now there's an example here for you of aggression and viewing violent media. So there is a positive correlation between aggression and watching violent media. That means that as aggression goes up, violent media being viewed goes up. And as aggression goes down, the viewing of violent media goes down. Now, because this is correlational, I can't say that the violent media causes the aggression or the aggression causes the violent media. All I can say is that the two things go together. They are co-related. It says then that children who are more aggressive tend to watch more violent television. We don't know the causation here, we just know that those two things go together. Other examples of positive correlations, height and weight, right? This is not a perfect correlation, but height and weight, as height goes up, weight tends to go up. As height goes down, weight tends to go down, which means that we could use this information to predict someone's weight if we knew their height, or to predict someone's height if we knew their weight. However, this is not a terribly strong correlation. We'll talk about strength of correlation in a second. And so, of course, we could make mistakes with this prediction, but it gives us a place to start trying to make that kind of prediction. Other examples of positive correlations, there's a very strong positive correlation between ice cream sales and violent crime. which I know sounds odd if you haven't heard that before, but yes, a very strong positive correlation. So as ice cream sales go up, violent crime goes up. And as ice cream sales go down, violent crime goes down. Now, am I saying that I can determine causation here, that those two things are causing each other? No, this is a correlation, and we'll talk about some possible outcomes of this in a second. But what I can say then is that if I know the rate of violent crime, I can predict ice cream sales. And if I know the rate of ice cream sales, I can predict violent crime, right? These things go together. So if a positive correlation means that they're going in the same direction, a negative correlation means they're going in opposite directions. So as one variable goes up, the other variable goes down. So for example, vaccinations and diseases, there's a negative correlation. So as vaccine rates go up, diseases go down. As vaccine rates go down, diseases go up. Also, another example of a negative correlation, let's see, as absences go up, grades go down. Absences go down, grades go up. As exercise goes up, weight goes down. As exercise goes down, weight goes up, right? Negative correlation just means that they are moving in opposite directions. They're still associated with each other, but they're just moving in opposite directions, okay? So we've talked about the direction of a correlation, and so you'll see here when we're talking about the numbers, the plus sign here means it's a positive correlation, the negative sign here means it's a negative correlation. And if you don't see a sign, then you assume that it's positive, right? So if we don't have a sign, it's positive. So now that we've talked about the direction and the positive versus negative, then we need to talk about the strength of a correlation. Now, a correlation can be any number between 0 and 1. So 0 means that there is no relationship, right? That they really are not related at all. A correlation of 1.00 is a perfect correlation, meaning that they always go together. Now, it's very rare to find a perfect correlation, but you can find strong correlations. A strong correlation, then, is a correlation where the number, the correlational coefficient, is close to 1, right? So we would say 0.8, 0.9, those are strong correlations. The strength of the correlation tells us how accurate our prediction will be. If we're making a prediction based off of a 0.2 correlation, that's not going to be very accurate. Make a prediction off of a 0.7, 0.8 correlation, it will be more accurate, right? So a correlation of 0.7 is stronger than a correlation of 0.2 because it is a higher number, because it's closer to 1, and 1 is a perfect correlation. So one thing to keep in mind when you're looking at the strength of a correlation is that you don't look at the direction. The direction is important. It tells us if it's positive or negative, but it doesn't tell us anything about the strength. And so you basically take the absolute value. In other words, you ignore the sign. You only look at the number. So a negative 0.5 correlation and a positive 0.5 correlation have the same strength, right? A negative 0.8 correlation is stronger than a positive 0.6 correlation. And a positive 0.8 correlation is stronger than a negative 0.6 correlation. You would only look at the number to determine the strength, okay? And just let me know if you have any questions about this. But when we're talking about correlations, we need to know the direction and the strength, okay? Now, limits of correlational research. A lot of research that is being done is correlational in nature. Why do people do correlational research? Because it's really, really easy. If I want to look for a correlation between class attendance and grades, all I have to do is get a spreadsheet of number of absences and grade, and it's super easy to do. As we'll see in a minute, experimental research is much harder. But the problem with correlational research is that correlation does not equal causation. You've probably heard that before, and you'll definitely hear it again. Correlation does not equal causation. It only tells us that two variables are related. So in my previous example about the violent crime and the ice cream sales, when we're talking about this correlation, it's a very strong, very proven correlation. We can't say that ice cream sales cause violent crime or that violent crimes cause ice cream sales, right? Which is usually where I insert my PMS joke, which I can do. I can get away with that because I'm female. But I wouldn't recommend using that. But if you are talking about the situation, there's also the possibility that there's a third variable that is causing both, right? And we typically think that this is the situation here, that it is heat, actually. So people tend to consume ice cream more during the summer. I don't know, I eat ice cream all year round, but some people, most people I suppose, tend to eat ice cream more in the summer. Well, violence also happens more in the summer. This is social psychology. You'll see in later lectures when we talk about aggression, people are more likely to be aggressive if they are uncomfortable. And so if it's hot outside, or if there's some kind of annoying noise or even a bad smell can make someone be aggressive, right, or more likely to be aggressive than they would be if they were more comfortable. And so this research tells us something important, that they are related and we can predict, but it doesn't tell us why violent crime happens, right? And of course, social psychology wants to know why. Maybe psychology in general. If we were going to sum up psychology very simply, we'd say we want to know why people do what they do. So then we need to do experimental research to determine why, to determine causation, right? So, if we are going to be looking at this, we need to understand, as I said, that correlation does not equal causation. And I just gave an example of this with the ice cream sales, but let's go through this one more time with the aggression in the violent media example. It says there are 3 possible causal relations when a correlation is found. So it could be that TV violence, media, causes the viewer to become more violent. And oftentimes this is what people think. This is how people tend to react when they hear this research. Oh, well, it's the media's fault. The violent video games or the violent movies are causing kids to be aggressive. And that certainly could be the case. But this is correlational research, so we don't know that for sure. It's also possible that aggressive kids are more likely to watch violent TV. And so children who are already aggressive, when given a variety of options, may be more likely to choose aggressive media to watch or video games to play. And then finally, it could be that there's a third variable causing both, for example, parental neglect, right? It's certainly possible that these children who perhaps you would consider letting very young children watch violent media is parental neglect. Also, perhaps they are being exposed to violence in other ways, and that maybe the parents are modeling that for them. So there could be a third variable that is causing both of these things to happen, both the children to be more aggressive and the children to watch more aggressive television. So unless we do an experiment, we're not going to know for sure. That means that we want to do experimental research as much as possible. So, experimental research, you're going to see that it is a lot harder to do than the other kinds of research that we've talked about. So, first of all, if we're going to do an experiment, we're going to have to select our participants, and we want to do a good job of selecting our participants. So, we need to do something called random selection. We want to make sure that our sample is representative. So, to understand this concept, we need to understand the difference between a population and a sample. So a population is all the individuals that you're interested in. So, for example, if I wanted to study college students, then maybe my population would be all college students in this country, right, or in the world. If I wanted to study third graders, then my population might be all third graders in this country, or all the third graders in the world, right? So, obviously, the population is the group that I'm interested in, but I can't have all of them be in my study. Why? Because it would take a lifetime and we still couldn't get everyone. We can't force people to be part of our study if they don't want to. Also, we don't have access to everyone, and so we can't get the entire population. We're going to have to select a sample from our population. Now, if we do a good job getting a sample, and our sample is representative of the population, then we can generalize our results. In other words, our sample should look like our population in all the things that are important to our study. That way we can say that the results from our sample are probably true of our population as well. And one way that we're going to get a random sample, or one way that we're going to get a representative sample, is to get a random sample. Now, a random sample means that every single person in the population has an equal chance of being chosen to be part of my study. So that way, any random differences, background, mood, anything, personality, all these things are randomly assigned between groups, which we'll talk about in just a second. But the idea here is that if every single person in the population has an equal chance of being chosen, then my sample is going to be representative. Now, this is easier to do with a smaller population. If my population is all the students that are enrolled in this class, then all I have to do is put 25 names in a hat and draw however many I want in my sample, maybe 5 out. And that way, if I put all your names in a hat and I randomly draw out names, then every person has the same chance of being selected, right? This gets a little bit harder when we have very large populations, right? It's not like we can put the names of every college student in the country in a hat, right? would be a really big hat. We don't necessarily have access to the names of every single person taking college classes in this country, so it can get harder, but as best we can, we need to try to have a representative random sample. Alright, so once we do random selection and we get our sample, we are then going to randomly assign participants into conditions. Okay? So I take a random sample from my population, and these are the people that are going to be in my study. I then randomly assign them into typically two conditions, the control group and the experimental group. Okay? Now I want my control group and my experimental group to be exactly the same except for the independent variable, the thing that we're going to manipulate. And I'm going to talk about this, the different variables, in just a second, and we'll have several examples to make sure this makes sense, right? But if I do a good job of randomly selecting my participants and randomly assigning them into groups, and I do good research, then I can say, yes, A caused B or B caused A, right? And so this is a very important type of research that needs to be done, but a lot of people aren't doing it because it is so difficult, right? So talking about the independent variable is the thing that you are manipulating, right? This is the thing that we want to be different between the control group and the experimental group. So let me give you an example. Let's say that we're interested in the effects of violent media on kids. So maybe my population is all students in elementary school in this country. Well, obviously I can't get all of them. So I take a random sample from my population, and then I randomly assign them, half into a control group and half into the experimental group. Now I want my control group and my experimental group to be exactly the same except for the independent variable. The independent variable is the thing that I am manipulating. In this case, it would be the type of show they watch. So the control group gets some kind of nonviolent television. I don't know, maybe a documentary on something. It's very difficult to find completely nonviolent television, but something. And then perhaps, maybe, I don't know, maybe Frozen? I don't know, there's still a frost giant throwing snowballs, but it's not too violent. And then on the other hand, the group that's in the experimental group gets a very, very violent video game or show, maybe, right? And so the independent variable is the thing that we're manipulating, so it is the only thing that should be different between the two groups. Therefore, then, the dependent variable is what we are measuring. So the dependent variable is our outcome measure, or what we are interested in. And so in this case, it would be the aggression, right? So we are wanting to see the impact of the independent variable on the dependent variable, or the impact of violent television on aggression, right? So let's have one more example here. Before I get into internal validity, I just want to make sure this makes sense. So let's have one more example. Let's say that we're interested in the effects of therapy on individuals who are depressed. So my population would be all the individuals in this country who are depressed. Obviously, I can't get all the depressed people to be in my study, so I get a random sample of people who are depressed. I then randomly assign them into an experimental group and the control group. Now, the experimental group is going to get kind of a placebo therapy or no therapy at all. Then the experimental group is going to get the new therapy. That means that I am manipulating the kind of therapy they receive. So the therapy is the independent variable. I am measuring their level of depression, therefore that is our dependent variable. Okay? If you have any questions about this, please let me know. This is the basic setup of research. It can get a lot more complicated than that, but these are some of the basic ingredients to a good experiment. So we want to make sure that our research are high quality. Remember that we said that we can determine causation with experiments if they're good experiments. If we don't do a good job, then we've just wasted our time, we've wasted our participants' time at the very least, and at the most we have misled people. So it's important to make sure that our research is of high quality. So one thing we want to think about with our research is validity. Now the term validity in general just means accuracy, right? Making sure that we're measuring what we're supposed to be measuring. Now internal validity is all about making sure that the independent variable is the only thing impacting the dependent variable, right? In other words, when we're talking about our aggression study, the independent variable is the type of show they watched. The dependent variable is aggression. I want the change that I observe in aggression, right, to be caused by the show that they watched. I want to make sure that my independent variable is influencing my dependent variable and nothing else is. Now, it's very difficult to try to control for everything to make sure that my independent variable is the only thing influencing the dependent variable. And think about all the other things that could influence aggression. So maybe we have naturally aggressive personalities or temperaments. Gender is one thing that influences aggression, right? Boys are more likely to be aggressive in certain ways than girls. So there are a lot of things. Hunger, discomfort, as we said earlier, temperature. There are so many things that influence aggression. And so to try to make sure that my independent variable is the only thing that's influencing my outcome or dependent variable, then I'm going to need to try to control for all of these other things that could possibly impact aggression. Once again, very, very difficult to do good experimental research. But some ways that we can increase internal validity, in other words, we can increase our confidence that our independent variable is the only thing that is playing a role in our dependent variable. One thing is to control extraneous variables. Now, these extraneous variables are variables that impact your dependent variable that are not your independent variable. In other words, let's say maybe the group that got Frozen got it in the morning and the group that watched the Violet movie got it in the afternoon. Now, that might seem like not a big deal. However, it could be that people have different personalities at different parts of the day. I tend to be more tired in the afternoon. Maybe the kids are hungry. So there could be some other variables that are causing the change in aggression. So we need to make sure then that they're watching the movie at the same time during the day and they're being measured at the same time during the day. That's just an example of a way to control for extraneous variables. This is very difficult because we can't always predict or think of ahead of time the extraneous variables that are going to come up, but trying to control for that. Like maybe we're worried about one group being hungry, and so we try to give them all the exact same snack right before they watch the movie, both groups. So we're trying to make sure that the only thing different between the two groups is the independent variable. Also, randomly assigning people is important. Random selection and random assignment helps with everything. But if we randomly assign people to these different conditions, like the control group or the experimental group, then theoretically there's no reason why all females would end up in one group and all males would end up in another group, right? We did this randomly. There's no reason why all of the already aggressive personalities would end up in one group and the already kind of laid back personalities would end up in another group. If we do it randomly, then we should get a good mix, theoretically. Now, we can also make sure that we got a good mix by measuring these variables before we get started. Maybe we can make sure we can do some kind of personality measure on the kids before we start the study to make sure the two groups were equivalent before we change things with the movie. We don't necessarily have to do that. That's a little bit above this class. But we want to make sure that we randomly assign so that all those little things that make us different are randomly distributed among the groups. Alright, so if internal validity is interested in making sure that our independent variable is the only thing impacting the dependent variable, external validity is concerned with generalization. Now, to say that our results generalize means that the results that I find in my lab with my sample apply to the real world, to my population. And so the results of a research study, if they don't generalize, then they don't really help us. Sure, we want to know what's true of the 20 or 30 people in our study, but we don't just want to know about our sample. We want to know what's true of the thousands and thousands of people in our population, right? When I talk about these aggressive children, I don't want to know how they respond in the lab because most kids are not in a lab. I want to know how they respond in their classrooms, on their playgrounds, and at home, right? And so external validity means that our results generalize or apply to other situations. Now, there are a couple of different kinds of external validity or generalizability. First of all, situations, and second of all, people, and I just referred to both of these. But when we're talking about situations, we want to make sure that what happens in the lab is consistent with what happens in real life, right? So we know that we behave a little bit differently when people are watching us. If we know that we're part of a research study, then we tend to behave a little bit differently. That could impact our external validity. A child in the lab might behave differently than they would behave at home. And so if we have this generalizability across situations, then we can say that the results that we found in our research study apply to other situations beyond our research study. And then also with people, what we're saying here is that the results of our sample really apply to our population. So we're not just saying that this is true of the 20 third graders that we have, we're saying this is true of most third graders, right? So both kinds of these very important. Now, how are we going to increase this external validity? Well, One way that we can do it is by using something called a cover story, trying to increase the psychological realism. Really what we're talking about here is deception, and deception happens more in social psychology than in most kinds of psychology or in most sciences in general. It says the cover story is a description of the purpose of a study given to participants that is different from its true purpose. In other words, we're not telling them what we're really doing. Now, there is value in this, and we'll talk more about this a little bit later in the lecture, but for example, if I told the children in my research study, I'm going to show you a really violent movie because I want to see if it makes you more violent. And we told the other children, we're going to show you a very boring movie because we don't think it's going to impact your aggression. I have now ruined my research study, right? Why? Because the children, A, they know what we're expecting to find, and so they'll behave the way we expected them to. And B, they know what you're doing. They know you're watching them. They know you're measuring them. That's going to change things. And so then, with that situation, since the participants are children, we could just not tell the children the purpose of the study and tell the parents the purpose, because as we'll talk about, the parents are the ones signing the consent forms. But if our participants are adults and they're signing their own consent forms, sometimes we have to deceive them. We have to give them a cover story that is not exactly accurate. And so we'll talk about ways to handle this later and when this is okay and when this is not okay, but that is one way to make the results generalized. If people don't realize that they are part of a study or they don't realize what you're really measuring, then they're more likely to behave the way they would in the real world. Okay, generalization across people, so making sure that our results apply not just to our sample but also to our population. Random selection is a great way to do that. So if everyone in the population has an equal chance of being chosen, then that really helps here. Also, getting a large sample size is helpful, right? If we're trying to represent a population of 20,000, then a sample of 20 is probably not enough, right? But, however, it is very difficult to get random selection. As I said, if we're talking about getting a random selection of college students in this country, it's very difficult to try to get students from each college and try to represent all the different majors. Very, very difficult. And so one way that it is sometimes justified in social psychology is to say, well, the things that we study are basic humanity, right? So we're going to study love and conformity and things that apply to everyone, and then therefore our results should apply to everyone, right? Because everyone feels love, right? There might be some kind of individual differences in the way that we feel love and the way that we feel about love, but we all experience love in some way, right? And so we could say that if we're studying basic fundamental psychological processes, then our results would apply to all people because we're just studying what it means to be human. I don't know how you guys feel about that, and we could debate that, but that is one argument that can be made. Alright, so another way that we're going to try to make sure that our results generalize is to use replication. And replication just means that we're going to repeat a study over and over again. So imagine that we have a sample of 20,000 people, or excuse me, imagine that we have a population of 20,000 people. We want to make sure that our sample is representative. So maybe we do this study with 100 participants and we find a certain result. We do it again with another 100 participants and find the same result. We do it again with another 100 participants, find the same result. If we keep replicating the same study over and over again, then we can feel pretty confident in our results, right? Another thing that we can do with replication is to repeat our study with a little bit different population. So maybe I found out this is true of college freshmen, so now I'm going to get some samples from college sophomores and I get some samples from college juniors, so we could change this, the subject a little bit. Or if this is true of people in early childhood, is it true of people in middle childhood, and so on and so forth. So we can also replicate with the different participants as well as with the same participants, right? So if we have replicated the same study several times, we feel pretty confident in our generalizations. However, what is going to happen if different experiments yield different results? Well, this is going to happen because every sample is a little bit different. And so you may find results that are a little bit different across different universities. You might find something that's true of NUW that's not necessarily true of MSU or Ole Miss, right, or other universities in Mississippi. The results may change a little bit. And so we can do something called a meta-analysis. Now, meta-analysis is a statistical technique that averages the results of multiple studies. And so if we've had several different professors doing the same research, or maybe one professor that did the same study several times, we can use a meta-analysis to kind of average those results together so that we can try to see what the overall picture is. And so a meta-analysis, I'm not going to go into any more detail about it than that, but if you've ever tried to read one, it can be a little bit dry, but it's really important to be able to compare multiple studies at once to kind of get the picture of, is this true for all people, right? Alright, so other ways to improve external validity or improving this generalization. We can use field experiments. A field experiment means that we're doing the study in a natural setting. That inside of the lab, people behave a certain way, and so then maybe we should conduct our research outside of the lab. So instead of doing our research in a lab, maybe we do our research like out in the real world, like go talk to students on the sidewalk instead of talking to them in the lab. That perhaps then students would be more, or whatever your participants are, would be more likely to behave the way they normally would or to give you the answers that they normally would, right? So then if we do our experiments out in the real world, participants might not even be aware that they're in an experiment. I talked last time about observational research where you're just observing people. People might not even realize that they are part of your research study. Or if they do realize it, they may not understand the true purpose, or they may just be more comfortable here. So external validity is high because it takes place in the real world. That means it is likely to generalize to those other situations as well. However, this leads us to a dilemma, right? We have said that internal validity means tightly controlling things, having tight control over everything, where the study takes place and the temperature in the room and the noises in the background and how hungry people are, controlling for everything so that the independent variable is the only variable influencing the dependent variable. But I just said, on the other hand, we can improve external validity by relaxing our control, by doing it in a real-world environment, by doing it out on the street. So when you increase internal validity and you tightly control for everything, you lose external validity, right? Because you can say, well, I found this result when all the kids had the same snack at the same time of day and the same amount of rest. Okay, that's internal validity, but it doesn't tell me, because not all kids are going to have the same snack at the same time of day with the same rest, our results don't generalize. On the other hand, when we do our results in the real world, we lose some control, and if we don't have control, then we can't be sure that there wasn't something else that was impacting our dependent variable other than our independent variable. So what are we going to do? This is always the dilemma in social psychology and just research in general. So one thing that you can do is you can start off with very tightly controlled internal validity studies, and so you control for everything and you see if you find something is true. And then you can do replication, where you gradually repeat the study by kind of releasing or letting go of some of your control, right? So it was true when we gave them all the same snack. Let's find out if it's true when we haven't given them all the same snack, right? And trying to let go of some of that control. All right, to have internal and external validity, experiments need to be well controlled and resemble the real world as much as possible. That's hard enough already, right? We just said that it is very difficult to have internal and external validity at the same time. But as if that's not enough, we also have to make sure that we're not causing our participants any undue or unnecessary stress, discomfort, or unpleasantness. In other words, we have to make sure that we are doing ethical research. We don't want to hurt our participants, obviously, but also we don't want to waste their time. We don't want them to not enjoy the study, right? To be, in an uncomfortable situation. And so on top of having internal and external validity, we also have to have ethical research. And there's a conflict here sometimes between the two. And as you get into some of the material this semester, you will find that a lot of the most famous studies in social psychology would not be done today if they hadn't already been done then, because they were not ethical. Not at all. All right. So how are we going to make sure we're doing good ethical research? Well, we're going to first of all get informed consent. Agreement to participate in an experiment, granted in full awareness of the nature of the experiment, which has been explained in advance. So when a participant gives their informed consent, they're saying, I know what we're going to do, I know why we're going to do it, I know all the possible benefits to myself and to society for my participation, I also know all the possible costs or problems that could come up, and I know that I can leave a study at any time, that my participation is voluntary, right? Informed consent is the basis of ethical research. That we're not doing anything to anyone that they don't agree to. However, this becomes an issue when we do deception, because perhaps giving someone the true purpose of the study or the true details of the study could ruin the study itself. When we do deception, we mislead participants about the true purpose of the study. Now, not all research in social psychology involves deception, but as I said, deception is fairly common. So how do you guys feel about this? It is an ethical as well as a moral question here. And I can't tell you what is morally acceptable. That's something that you have to decide within yourself when you're lying in bed at night. But what is ethically acceptable here? If we are going to do deception, then we are going to have to take some additional measures to make sure that nothing is harming our participants, right? So there are some extra things. As a researcher, you take an extra responsibility upon yourself because participants are not necessarily able to gauge for themselves whether or not they want to participate because they don't know the true study or the true participation, the true procedures. And so you as the researcher are going to have to make sure that you're taking care of your participants, right? So how are we going to do ethical research here? Well, first of all, we're going to submit to an IRB, an Institutional Review Board. This is a group that meets and reviews research to make sure that it is ethical before it happens, right? In this situation, the IRB is going to have a great deal of power, and usually universities that do a substantial amount of research have their own IRB. That is going to review this research. And so, as I said, a lot of the research studies that were done in the past would not be approved by IRBs today, so they're not going to be replicated today. So this is important that we have someone looking over our shoulder, making sure that we're doing a good job with our research, that we're being ethical. Also, we're going to obtain informed consent whenever possible. Now this, as we said, is difficult when we're doing deception, but getting informed consent. And then debriefing participants afterwards. So when you do a debriefing, what you're really doing is telling the participants exactly what happened and exactly why it happened, as well as giving them some contact information to someone they can talk to if they have any questions or concerns, right? Now, you should always debrief participants after a research study, but especially if deception has happened. So after the study is over, there's nothing to gain by not telling your participants what has just happened. And so some participants may not be happy when they find out that you deceived them, but it's crucial to share this information with them after you've already finished the study, okay? And once again, if you're using deception, then you just have to try really hard to make sure that you are setting up a research study that is reasonable and it's not going to hurt anyone, okay? Alright, so today's lecture video is probably going to be a little bit longer than most of our lecture videos will be, that we have a lot of information to get to. And so now we've finished up research, we're going to start talking about social perception. And today, really, what we're going to talk about is communication. The social perception is the study of how we form impressions of and make inferences about other people. So when we first meet someone, what is it that we notice, right? How do we form impressions of other people? And those first impressions can be really, really important, right? And how we make inferences about them, so what we think about someone after we meet them, what we assume about them, right? So we say that we shouldn't judge a book by its cover, right? That sometimes the most easily observable things don't always tell an accurate picture, right? So do we judge someone based on the first encounter that we have with them, or what they're wearing, or what they look like, right? Obviously we do. This is kind of human nature to make these first impressions, to judge a book by its cover, but we need to be careful. We need to pay attention because sometimes our judgments are not accurate, right? But one thing that we're going to talk about today that's very crucial to that first impression, or to judging a book by its cover, is communication, and the kinds of both verbal and nonverbal communication that we use. We often use this to gather information about other people, right? Look at these faces here, okay? It says, what emotion do you think is being displayed on each of these faces? And so these faces have been computer animated to some of them appear more masculine and some to appear more feminine. Research suggests that it's actually easier to detect anger on the male faces and happiness on female faces. So detecting these facial features, or these kinds of facial expressions. This is a type of nonverbal communication. So one of the things that we notice about people, first of all, is are they smiling? Do they look happy, or do they look angry? And research says we're more accurate when it comes to detecting anger on male faces and happiness on female faces. And I wonder why this is. If this is truly that men tend to have more stoic expression and women tend to smile more, perhaps, or maybe this is just what we are expecting. We have these kind of gender expectations. Whatever the case may be, we find a gender difference here. So when we're talking about nonverbal communication, it says the way in which people communicate intentionally or unintentionally without words. Now, there are lots of different types of nonverbal communication, right? So it's not what we're saying, perhaps, but how we're saying it, right? So the tone of voice that we use, our hand gestures, our posture, for example, how close we stand to someone, our facial expressions. There are lots of different ways of non-verbally communicating. And perhaps our nonverbal communication is as informative or more informative than verbal communication, right? Which leads us right into our activity for this week. So activity 1. Remember that activities need to be completed on the Canvas website. And so this should be released for you now. You can go in, type it in there, and you need to make sure that it is a minimum of 200 words long, right? And this is going to be due by Friday at 5 p.m. So it says list at least one nonverbal sign of each of the following emotions: anger, fear, disgust, happiness, surprise, sadness. So these basic emotions, I want you to tell me what's at least one nonverbal sign. So perhaps I'll give you a freebie. Perhaps with happiness, a smile might be a way that someone communicates happiness to you without using their words, right? And so tell me at least one nonverbal sign of each of the following. And then just tell me how you feel about nonverbal communication. So is it informative? And give me an example of a time when nonverbal communication was helpful for you. So maybe you noticed someone that what they were saying and what they were doing wasn't lining up, right? Or maybe they walked in, they said good morning, and they were trying to sound positive, but they were slamming things and they were frustrated. Right, so sometimes nonverbal communication makes situations easier to understand. So tell me a little bit about your thoughts on nonverbal versus verbal communication this week, okay? And if you have any questions about the activity, just let me know. So nonverbal cues include facial expressions, tone of voice, gestures, body position and movement, the use of touch, gaze. So think about the ways that we use these in a regular conversation, right? So when you have a conversation with someone, you have one thing is eye contact, right? So we have a certain amount of eye contact that we consider appropriate, right? We wouldn't like it if someone didn't look us in the eye when they were talking to us, but we don't want them to stare at us, right? So we have to have some kind of break in the eye contact. Body position is really important. How close do you stand to someone? Well, that depends on who it is and the purpose of why you're talking to them, right? There's a certain distance that is appropriate if you are a stranger, or if you don't know someone well, or if you're a student going to talk to a professor, right? Then standing extremely close to that person could make that interaction a little bit uncomfortable, right? So there are all of these things that are nonverbal, so it's not what we're saying, but it's how we're saying it and what we're doing that's important, right? So we have mirror neurons that help us, especially with this nonverbal behavior. It says these are special brain cells that are activated when we perform an action and when someone else performs the same action. So, for example, if we see someone else crying, our mirror neurons fire, just as they would as if we were crying, right? So this is our basis of our ability to feel empathy. Empathy means that you look at another person and you are able to understand what they're going through. You can put yourself in their shoes, right? You can take their perspective. And so we have these mirror neurons that help us to do this, to help us to see someone else's behavior or see what they're doing and to understand them and to feel what they're feeling, right? Some people have more keenly developed abilities to empathize than others, and certain careers, like, for example, psychology, are kind of built on the ability to empathize with other people, right? But these mirror neurons are the basis, or biological basis, for being able to understand other people and being able to empathize with them. And so it's very important for communication. So nonverbal communication can tell us a lot. Nonverbal behavior has several different functions. First of all, it can express emotion. So when we talked about those emotions in our activity earlier, I don't know if you guys saw Inside Out, but when I was writing that activity, I kept thinking about Inside Out, right, with anger and sadness and everything. Sorry, I have kids, but whether or not you have kids, Inside Out is a great movie, very psychological. So it can express emotions. So someone who is perhaps not telling you what they're feeling can still express that in nonverbal ways. Like if you see the person crying, they're just not talking a whole lot, then you think, okay, that person is sad. Or they walk in and say, I'm fine. Well, does I'm fine ever mean fine? Sometimes I suppose it does. But the person's slamming doors and they're angry and they're frustrated, right? That is expressing an emotion to you, and that gives you valuable information, right? Also, it can convey an attitude, right? Think about the ways that we use nonverbal communication when we are interested in someone, when we're flirting with someone, maybe. And so the ways that we use touch and the way that we use gaze or eye contact, right? It can communicate an attitude. But we can also use nonverbal communication to communicate the I don't like you, right? So sometimes you're in a situation where you're trying to let the other person know, kind of like back off, right? You kind of have that stamped on your forehead, right? You can convey an attitude with your nonverbal behavior. If you're crossing your arms and you're not looking at the person, you can kind of let them know that you're not interested, right? Also, this is a way to communicate your personality. So, for example, people who are extroverted are people who are probably going to be smiling a lot, or people who are probably going to be using their hands a lot when they talk, right? Gesturing. Like right now, you guys can't see me, but this entire lecture I've been gesturing with my hands because I talk with my hands. So this can communicate something about your personality as well. And so there are a lot of different functions of nonverbal behavior. And I feel like we can get a lot of really good information this way. Sometimes, as I previously alluded to, nonverbal behavior can contradict spoken words. So the person who says, I'm fine, I'm fine, right? But clearly they're not fine, they're angry, right? Their tone is telling you that they're angry. Or sarcasm is another example, right? I'm so happy for you. There are a lot of different ways that you can say that. You know, you can say, I'm so happy for you. That's kind of a genuine, or I'm so happy for you, right? Sarcastically. You wouldn't know what the person meant if perhaps they sent it in a text message, right? Great thing about text messaging is that it is devoid of most nonverbal cues, right? All you have is the verbal information. So sometimes somebody sends you a text message and you're trying to figure out how they meant it, right? And so still you can have some things that are like smiley faces or some other like cues that are in there to try to give a hint. But sometimes it can be harder when you're reading like an email, you're trying to figure out exactly what the person is saying, because when we have this face-to-face conversation, we can pick up on all this nonverbal behavior that can be really helpful, right? But sarcasm is a classic example where what you're saying, the actual content, the words, don't necessarily measure up with what you're feeling or trying to communicate, right? Also, we use nonverbal behavior to substitute for verbal messages. So sometimes we can use symbols, right? We do like the okay sign, or perhaps a rather rude gesture that you can make to someone in traffic. Don't ever do that. Don't be rude to people. Road rage is crazy. But anyway, you can use these symbols, right, to substitute for verbal messages. But you have to be careful with these because you don't always know what they mean. I have been told that the okay sign is actually considered obscene in some cultures, a reference to anatomy. I'll let you figure that out or Google that, right? But the idea here is that if we don't understand the culture that we're going to, they could have very different nonverbal behavior than we do. And so then we could end up offending someone with our gestures. Also, different cultures have different norms about things like eye contact, where in some situations maybe making eye contact is disrespectful, right? And so there are cultural differences to this nonverbal behavior that we are really taught from a very young age. So, are the facial expressions of emotion universal? This kind of leads into what I'm talking about with cultural differences. What I mean here is the way that we express emotion, does that apply to all cultures? Yes, actually, it does for the major emotions. So the 6 major emotions: anger, happiness, surprise, fear, disgust, and sadness, right? So for these major emotions, these are the ones that develop earliest in life and the ones that are seen across all cultures. And the facial expressions tend to be the same, right? Anger in our culture looks very similar to anger in other cultures, right? The same with happiness and all these others. It says the 6 major emotions are the first to occur in human development. So very young children have these. I mean, think about very young children that you've been around. They are happy, right? They are angry, certainly. Surprised, sad, right? All these things, fear, all these emotions are kind of part of our nature from the time that we're born. We have these emotions. However, other emotions develop later, because to feel these emotions, you have to kind of be able to take other people's perspectives and to be able to see things outside of yourself. Things like guilt, shame, embarrassment, pride. Guilt and shame are 2 that are very similar, and I'm not sure if I've referenced this in this class yet, but you know, shame and guilt are really a difference between whether we feel bad about who we are, which would be more shameful, versus something that we've done, which would be more guilt, right? But we have to be able to take other people's perspectives to be able to experience these, right? Also embarrassment, pride. So we have to know that we have offended someone else, or that we have done something we shouldn't do to feel embarrassed, right? Or we have to know that we've done something good to feel proud. And so this kind of is a part of our development later in life. And so for these other emotions, they are a little bit different across cultures. Whereas the 6 major emotions are pretty much the same in the way that we feel them and the way that we express them, there are a lot of differences in these other kind of self-conscious emotions also, that are tied to that social interaction and the way that we experience our other cultures, right? So sometimes it is difficult to understand other people's nonverbal communication. And there can certainly be a lot of miscommunication here if you're trying to send a message to someone and that person is not getting it, right? Like if you've ever tried to be in a conversation with someone where you're trying to end the conversation and the other person doesn't understand, right? Or where maybe you're trying to send a message that they're just not picking up on. And so it can be difficult to understand nonverbal communication, especially with someone who is from a different culture than you. But even in someone who is in the same culture, why is it hard to understand nonverbal communication, right? Sometimes someone is just being friendly and yet we think they're flirting with us, right? Or sometimes they're flirting with us and we think they're just being friendly. It's difficult. One reason why it's difficult to understand this nonverbal communication, and especially facial expressions, and specifically, affect blends, right? So it is certainly possible that we could have multiple emotions being shown at one time, right? So you see people who are smiling but they're crying, right? One part of the face looks sad, one part of the face looks happy, and so what does that mean, right? Someone is smiling but they're crying. Are they happy? Are they sad? And maybe both, right? Also, people try to mask their emotions, and there are sometimes some very good reasons to do this. One thing when I'm like interacting with my kids, I really want to try not to reinforce bad behavior, but sometimes my kids do something that is like funny, right? Like sometimes kids will do something and it's like, it's funny, but you're trying not to let them see you smile, and so you're trying to like mask that emotion. Another thing is when you're a psychologist, if you're seeing a client, it's very important to be able to not look shocked or to not look like you're, judging them. So you have to kind of keep that mask that emotion, right? Other times it's not always as helpful. If you're in a relationship with someone, you need to be able to share your emotions with them, but sometimes we try to hide them, right? Also, it's difficult to understand facial expressions or nonverbal communication in general because there are cultural differences to it. And there are cultural differences not just between different countries, but even in our country. There are differences in different parts of the country. Like I had a student tell me once that he held the door open for, it was a male student told me that he held the door open for a female student, said that she walked through the door and then turned back and said, by the way, I have a boyfriend. Right. So then, or is that flirtatious to hold the door open for someone else, or is that just good manners? It depends on what part of the country you grew up in. And so our culture can be very different even within one country, right? And so because of these reasons, sometimes it's difficult to understand nonverbal communication, right? So when we're talking about culture and nonverbal communication, one thing that we talk about is a display rule. A display rule dictates what kind of emotional expression people are supposed to show. So in some cultures, it is frowned upon to show emotion or to show any kind of reaction. You're supposed to remain more stoic, right? Whereas in other cultures, it's fairly common to demonstrate emotion. In our culture, I think it depends. There's certainly times when we tend to be more free with ourselves than I think people in other cultures do. But also, think about when you walk up to someone, you say, "How are you doing today?" Right? What you really mean is like, hi, like you're being friendly, you're being polite. And the correct response to "How are you doing today?" is, "I'm doing great," or "I'm making it," or "It's almost Friday," or something like that, right? Even if it's Monday, it's almost Friday, right? And so we have these like cultural norms here. It would not be a cultural norm for you to say, "How are you doing today?" to a stranger, and the stranger goes, "Well, let me tell you. I hope you have an hour because I have a lot to tell you," and sit down and starts crying. We would think that that was strange, right? Because in our culture, the reaction to that is supposed to be, not very detailed. So this is culture specific. And also, I think we have different display rules for males versus females, right? If we talk about watching a Nicholas Sparks movie, we probably expect the women in the room to be choking up and tearing up, and we don't expect the men to be, right? That perhaps in our culture we expect men to be more stoic or to kind of withhold their emotional responses more than women. And so display rules can be different in a lot of different situations, but it kind of dictates what is the social norm or what is appropriate way to display emotion, right? So we're talking about display rules and the display of emotion. It says that there are different rules for women and men in America. Absolutely, as I was saying, that there are certain things. Also, earlier we talked about smiling, like showing happiness versus anger, and it's easier to detect anger on male faces and easier to detect happiness on female faces. And so there are a lot of differences in emotion between men and women in our culture, and perhaps more in the South than in other parts of the country, but just especially in our country in general. Some other examples here when it comes to smiling and display rules. Japanese women hide their smiles behind their hands, right? That they tend to try to kind of hide that or repress that smile. Whereas in our culture, women are allowed or encouraged to smile often. In fact, in our culture, if someone never smiles, we think there's something wrong with that. Like we expect people to smile. And perhaps we expect people to smile even if they don't feel like smiling. But that's just part of our cultural norm. And so kids learn this from society, right? This is nurture. This is something that comes from our environment. And sometimes it can be difficult to try to live up to the norms of your culture, right? When it comes to negative facial expressions or trying to like hide that we're upset, it says Japanese individuals tend to cover up their negative expressions with smiles and laughter, so trying to kind of laugh things off and not demonstrate a lot of negative facial expressions. And they tend to display fewer facial expressions in general. And so when we say in the West or in Western culture, our culture being kind of individualistic versus collectivist cultures tend to be more Eastern cultures, we tend to show a lot of facial expression, whether it be positive or negative. We smile a lot, we cry a lot, we frown a lot. We're very expressive in our culture, and that's just not true of other places. And so if you were to travel to other places, or you were to spend time around people from different cultures, they might not understand you, and you might not understand them, because some of these kind of givens, things that we expect from other people, are not necessarily true in other cultures, right? Another thing we talked about a little bit earlier, gaze. Americans feel suspicious when a person doesn't look them in the eye, right? And so we might say that I think that person is lying because they can't look me in the eye, or they're not comfortable with me, right? You don't want to talk to someone who's wearing glasses. There was one individual that I interacted with earlier in life who always looked at my mouth when I was talking. And I kind of wondered if maybe she had trouble hearing or something, because she was always like looking at my mouth. But she never looked me in the eye, and it was always made me feel a little bit uncomfortable because I didn't understand why she couldn't make eye contact with me, right? So we tend to expect people to look us in the eye, but as I said, in other cultures, it might be seen as a sign of disrespect to stare at someone, right? Also, if I'm doing an in-person class with this lecture, I always try to demonstrate this. I ask a student to volunteer, and then I make like intense eye contact with that student until he gets uncomfortable. It doesn't take long. 5 to maybe 8 seconds, everyone in the classroom starts giggling uncomfortably, like this is really awkward. And any longer than that, it's just uncomfortable to have this eye contact. And so there's a certain amount of time where it's normal, like you want the teacher to make eye contact with you, and a certain amount that's excessive. And so that's very specific to your culture. Also, personal space. It says Americans like a bubble of open space, a few feet in radius. Now, there are individual differences here, but for the most part, who gets to come into your bubble? The people that you invite into your bubble. Other people shouldn't be in your bubble. And usually when I do in-person classes, I have students who have very intense reactions to this. Yes, don't get in my personal space. I like my personal space, right? But in other cultures, strangers stand next to each other to the point of touching and feel comfortable with that. And so it's not that there is a right or wrong way to do this verbal and nonverbal communication. It's just different between different cultures, right? Which is something that will continue to be a theme throughout the class, right? Emblems here, nonverbal gestures that have well understood definitions. This is kind of what I was talking about earlier when we said that a function of nonverbal communication can be to replace verbal communication, like for example using signs, but you have to be careful with these because other cultures might have different emblems, and so they might not understand you when you do some kind of sign that you think means something very innocent, could mean something not so innocent in other cultures. So always do your research. It is just a good idea to research other cultures before you go there, right? All right, excellent. So that is the end of lecture for this week. So I know this was a lot of material. Thank you very much for your attention. If you have any questions about the material, let me know. Also, don't forget about the activity for this week. Must be a minimum of 200 words. And then just let me know if you need anything, and I will talk to you guys next week.